Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. Once you're done painting for the day, what do we do with all of this? Should you let it dry? Should you clean it out? This answer is going to really depend on how you like to work, but let's explore some of the options. Typically when I'm done painting, I will let all of this sit in here and just dry. Once it's dry, then I'll close it up. If you close this up while it's still really wet, you increase your chances of getting things like mold because the moisture is going to stay in here. But why would I just leave these in here to dry? And that's because since it's watercolor, we can reactivate these colors. So see, this is dry here, nothing on my finger. But if I put a little water in my brush, the pigment reactivates and I can use it to paint again. I don't like to waste a lot of paint, so a lot of times I'll leave them in here and then it will kind of define the color palette for the next thing I'm going to paint. And I keep that going for a while until it's just a little bit too messy or if I need to change out the color palette for something I'm painting. Then you've got a couple options. One, you could take this over to the sink and just wash this out and carefully try not to get these too wet. Or what I typically like to do is I will just spray my palette like this. And then I'll take a paper towel and I can just wipe it out. And usually I can just do that with whatever rag or thing I was using to actually tap my brush off while I was painting so that there's not extra waste. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. And it's finally time for us to talk about tubes. I've gotten a ton of questions about how to use tube paints because mainly in these tutorials, I'm showing you using paints like these. Tube paints are wonderful and really pigmented when they are a good brand that you like and trust. This series is for beginners, which probably means you've got a beginner budget. And the really nice brands like Core and Daniel Smith can cost you like $15 or sometimes even more for a single tube of color. And you can buy a set like this that ranges from about $20 to $40 and you're gonna get 12 or maybe even more colors. You can buy tube watercolors that are more in the kind of budget arena. Like these are a lot less than buying a whole set of Daniel Smith ones. But what I find with more budget options in the tube paint arena and even more budget ones than this is that the quality wildly varies. A lot of them, this is blue, were so badly separated that I had to pour like a third of the product out. Look at this, it's still happening because the binder is completely separated from it. So I have a hard time recommending budget option tube paints because I have seen this in a lot of different brands on the budget end of the spectrum. And in pan paints, the quality doesn't vary as much. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. How do we use tube paints? Now, these are dried and then they have to be reactivated with water. And these come in kind of a gel or like a creamy type state. You do still use water with them and you're gonna work with them more or less the same way as you do this, except for the beginning part. First thing you're gonna need is a palette, and there are all kinds of different palettes. The main thing you're looking for is some area where you can place the paint, and then some area where you can mix up the colors. I like this for little small projects or when I'm trying to save space, but I like this one for bigger projects or if I want to do some of the little kind of mixing on the sides like this one. Actually using the paints is pretty simple. What you want to do is whatever colors you're going to be using, you're just going to take the tube, open it up, squeeze out just a little dollop. Remember, you can always squeeze out more. See this compared to the size of my finger. Then I have my brush and then something to transfer water with. You could use your brush, you could use something else. But if I were to try to mix up this color, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a damp brush. Then I'm going to just take a little bit of this color at a time, put a little on my brush, and swirl it into the water. And then I can adjust the color and saturation by adding more in here or more water if I want it less saturated. To mix up a different color with it, you just squeeze a little of that onto the palette, dip my brush in that color, and then mix it up, and now I've modified the color. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. The benefits of tube paint, once you find a good one, is that it is easier to get a more concentrated color because it's just a little bit more accessible because it's already in that kind of gel state. And so it's easier to grab more of that and put it into the water, as well as some of the really nice ones are just gonna be more pigmented colors. But the other benefit is that they are more versatile because you can work with them in this state, but you can also buy empty tins like this that come with the little half pans. And these will be empty, but then you just squeeze that color into one of these little pans, leave this open to dry for quite a while. You might need it to dry for like a week before you can really close this. And you can see that I'm the one that filled these because they're kind of lumpy. But then you can reactivate them with water, just like you would pan paints. So potentially you can have both. You could turn a tube of this into a dried pan, but also keep some of it in the tube so that you have it dried and then you also have it in its kind of creamy state. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. And today we're talking tape. In the next video, we will be talking about different types of tape, but today we're gonna focus on why you use tape and how to use it. To tape something down, you're just gonna take your tape and ideally you wanna tape it to something you can move around, not directly to your desk. Because sometimes in watercolor we need to use gravity, and by having it on something we can move around, we can do that. You wanna get as even of borders as you can because that's going to affect the final look. There are two main reasons why we might tape something down. The first is it's going to stop it from moving around on us. The second reason is that when you're working with lots of water, the paper is going to buckle. By taping it down, it's going to buckle in a more predictable or even way. I'm going to paint one that's taped, and then we're going to paint this other one not taped. Right away we can see that the one that's not taped has started to move around a lot more than the one that's taped down. Wait and see what happens over about the next minute. As you can see, it has curved even more, and this would be really hard to continue to paint on. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners, and today we're talking tape. Figuring out what type of tape to use for watercolor can be really overwhelming because there's a ton of different types. Honestly, there's a ton of good options and most of them are going to work pretty well. I have tested all sorts of tapes and the only one I couldn't see using at all was frog tape because it has a coating that sucks up some of the moisture. When selecting tape, you're going to have to figure out what's important to you. So I'm going to give you my recommendations based on 3 different categories. The first is budget. If you're on a budget, Scotch tape or generic masking tape is going to be your best bet. The second variable is gentleness. You're the kind that cannot stop tearing your watercolor paper and you need it to be gentle. The best options are going to be a drafting tape, washi tape, or I also like this Ichiban 241 tape. These are all very gentle on paper. As a matter of fact, the drafting tape and washi tape will sometimes pull up while you're painting, which can cause other problems, but it's not going to tear your paper. And the third one is crisp lines. How crisp do you want the edges to be? I find that the Ichiban 241, any sort of Scotch tape, or a washi tape with a waxy coating is going to provide the most crisp edges. Personally, I find myself reaching most for just generic masking tape, but that's also because I go through a lot of it because I'm doing a ton of these videos and paintings, and this is the most economical. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners, and we're talking about tape. One of the scary things about using tape is that it can tear your paper when you're done, and there are 3 main tricks to making sure that that doesn't happen. The first is making sure your paper is completely dry because the paper is more fragile when it's wet. The second is that heat can actually help to release the adhesive, so if you heat the tape up, it's going to come off easier. And the final tip is to go slow and pull at an angle. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. We've talked about different types of tape, how to use tape, and now we're going to do a fun exercise using tape. Start by taping your piece of paper down to something, and then picking a tape that you like the thickness of. We're going to be doing a 2-layer plaid exercise. Start by placing the tape down horizontally, approximately as much space as the tape is wide in between these. Once you have it taped up, spray your watercolors, and then in all the gaps, I want you to paint the whole thing in one color. Then we're going to dry this completely and remove the tape. Next, we're going to apply the tape vertically, again trying to leave about as much space in between as the tape is wide. Then we're going to switch to another color and we're going to paint the gaps we left between the tape vertically. Dry this completely and remove the tape. And like that, we've made plaid. It kind of looks like a little picnic blanket. I did get a bit of bleeding on that second layer. This probably happened as a combination of 2 things. One is that I picked a washi tape. They're not super sticky, so this can happen. And the second is that I didn't push it down super hard, and so the edges might not have adhered right. Even if it doesn't all go according to plan, this one is super fun. It creates really interesting effects. You're going to see some layering, and you're also going to learn how to use tape as a resist. Watercolor tutorials for absolute beginners. And today we're going to talk about what you can paint watercolor on. Technically, you can paint on anything. What it's going to come down to is how well is it going to stick to it and how many watercolor-esque effects you can get on it. This will probably come as no surprise, but the best thing to paint watercolor on is watercolor paper. Even within watercolor paper, there's going to be some differences. Cotton-based paper is going to work better than a cellulose-based paper, and something that's at least 140 pounds is going to work better than a thinner paper. You can paint on any type of paper, however, it's not going to have as much bleeding together, and the paper is going to crinkle so much it's going to make it difficult to paint, and it can actually bleed through to the other side. With watercolor, the key to the surfaces is it porous? So something like this uncoated canvas you can paint watercolor on, but a primed and prepared canvas like this is not as porous. And so when we try to put it on, it's just gonna ball up and not really stay there. Another porous thing you can paint watercolor on is wood. However, when you paint it on there, it does soak into the wood grain and become really hard to control. But there is a fix for this, because if you want to paint on something that's too porous and too hard to control, or not porous enough, you can use watercolor ground. I prepared this one with watercolor ground in that rectangle and was able to make a simple watercolor painting. And this one I did not prepare, and you can see that you can still paint on it, it's just not very controlled. Watercolor ground is a paste that you apply and then let dry, and once dry, it mimics the abilities of paper to accept watercolor. Watercolor on tons of things. It just depends on how well you want it to stick, how much control you want over it, or if you want to prepare it, then you can paint on anything.